Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to welcome you to one of the first lectures of our 2003 New England Civil War Symposium, The North and the Civil War. Our first speaker is a longtime friend, Dr. Herman Hattaway. Hattaway, at the time we met him back in '94, was already very well established in the field. He had produced some outstanding books that are still the standards, how the South lost the Civil War, why the North won the Civil War, and so forth. And so when you approached Hattaway, you realized that you were talking with a man who had a very sophisticated understanding of the war. He was also a showman. As I've said in earlier talks, if you heard some of the talks 8-9 years ago, Herman always was selling his books and he'd quote from them and so forth. And it became kind of a funny side note to that was watching Herman flog books that were now 15 or 20 years old, and most people either had them and read them or whatever, but you couldn't take the salesman out of Herman. And to get the nuggets that he was offering, you had to accept that was a core part of who he was and how he represented himself. And so when I invited him, because it made sense, that book, How the North Won the Civil War, was huge. And I think that was a seminal moment in the study of the war. It is certainly one of the most important books of the 70s and 80s. I'm not sure exactly when it came out, but he and Dick Barringer and William Steele and Archer Jones collaborated on these and did wonderful things. And I think Herman's last work that I'm aware of was a book that was a simple compendium of the Civil War known as Shades of Blue and Gray, in which he gave Blue and Gray a big shout out, and also gave Parker Hills a shout out for a monograph he had done on a study in warfighting, Nathan Bedford Forrest and the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads. So Herman was a good guy. Herman took care of you, and he was the host of a preservation conference we did for Price's Raid out in Kansas City, Missouri, 8 or 9 years before this. And so I have a lot of affection for Herman. I don't know if he's still alive or not. I hadn't heard that he had passed, but certainly if he's still alive, he would be in his mid to late 80s, maybe even his 90s. So sit back. I think you'll enjoy what he has to say. This is one of the great historians of the late 20th century, and I think you'll be rewarded for spending the time listening to him talk about how the North won the Civil War.
Hello, everyone. Good morning to you. For those of you that are hearing me for the first time, I want to share with you that I'm wearing this suit for the first time. A couple of firsts. At least co-equal with the biggest thing that impacted on my career was to discover that I had a penchant for collaboration, and that I encountered some awfully good collaborators, most notably Archer Jones, who is something of a master of military strategy, great student of the art and the history of the people who have written on that topic, most notably Karl von Clausewitz and Antoine Jomini and somebody named von Bülow. And I would rate collaborating with great people like Archer Jones right up there with working as a graduate student under T. Harry Williams. That's what shaped my career. Williams introduced me to Jones at a professional meeting, and we were both on a circuit somewhat like this. It was a Civil War roundtable circuit with speeches I comparing and contrasting the generals on both sides, and Jones comparing and contrasting the presidential leadership on both sides. He proposed that we meet at Omaha. He was in North Dakota and I in Kansas City at a convention where we discussed the possibility of perhaps doing a little article together, combining our two speeches. That was the germ for what became a very large book called How the North Won. And that has been a tremendous success for me in my life in Korea. It was published first in 1983. It is not only still in print, both in hardbound and paperbound edition, but a couple of years ago, the Easton Press brought it out in leather-bound edition. Now, I know that a lot of other folk have books bound in leather with their name on them. Brooks might too, I don't know. But I'll tell you what, it's an ego trip to have a leather-bound book with your name on it sitting on a piece of furniture in your living room. I came out of Louisiana State University, and I developed quite a chummy relationship with the recently retired acquisitions editor, Maureen Hewitt, and she said to me something to the effect, "Why don't you send us a manuscript?" I said, "My God, Maureen, you've turned down two of mine already." My first book, which was a biography of Confederate General Stephen D. Lee, and they also had a shot at how the North won. I have a letter from the director of the University of Illinois Press, Richard L. Whitworth, informing Archer Jones and me about the coming of the leather-bound edition, and he said, "I bet Les Philyabaum," that's the then director of the LSU Press, "would like to kick in the butt whoever wrote a negative assessment of that book." He said, "We've made our share of mistakes too, but nothing of this magnitude." I love that. Eric Fona wrote the evaluation. You can hardly call it a review because it was really sort of an extended blurb for the History Book Club issue of How the North Won. And he said, "It would seem that the authors very carefully selected their title because it's not about why the South lost." And that turned out to be true. We wrote a separate book about why the South lost and published it 3 years later. The North won and the South lost, but for different reasons, really. Now, how could the South have won the Civil War? There are three ways. First and foremost, if they could have achieved what Robert E. Lee very much wanted to do, which was to score a knockout, killing victory, preferably on northern soil, to just win the war militarily. Second, possibly to get some foreign aid. What the South needed was a Saratoga. Now, if you know what that means, fine, and if you don't, I'm going to tell you. There's two really significant wars that we're interested in, wherein the weaker side won. That's the American Revolution and the Vietnam War. The weaker side won. In the case of the American Revolution, because the colonialists were able to achieve such a spectacular victory in upstate New York, Saratoga, it showed the European powers that they had a chance to win. And they wanted to intervene, and did, most notably France. The United States would not have won the revolution without the intervention of France, in spite of good fighting on the part of the American troops and good generalship on the part of George Washington especially, but some of the others too, including Henry Knox and who was it down in South Carolina at the Battle of the
Samuel Green.
Yeah, Green and others, yeah. These are good generals, to be sure, but nonetheless, the French provided the scale tip. Now, in the case of the Vietnam thing, our leaders messed up big time. And Dien Bien Phu, which convinced the French that they were getting out, should have told us something and didn't. But the war weariness factor came into play there, and the press fed the war weariness factor. And Tet, the Tet Offensive is generally regarded as the last great successful campaign by the North Vietnamese, bringing about the end. But the fact is, the United States military won back everything it lost in the Tet Offensive. The press wanted to give up and get out, and they persuaded the American people to do it. It's a matter of war weariness. And so that is the third and last of the three ways that the weaker side can win a war. If it can persuade the populace of the other side that it just isn't worth it. It's costing too much, it's lasting too long. Let's just cut our losses and go home. Now, it has been often said that the South got the cream of the old professional officer corps. That's not really true. What the South got was about its appropriate share. They both got a share, and the South got about the appropriate share. What is true is that at the outset, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was a better military manager than Union President Abraham Lincoln was, and the Confederacy succeeded early in the war in getting its better people into higher positions of responsibility earlier. It took the Union a while to do that, but they eventually did do it. Lincoln grew a lot, as I will talk tomorrow in greater detail about, whereas Jefferson Davis did not grow a lot. Davis started out pretty good. He was, after all, a West Point graduate. He was a veteran of the Mexican War, a hero, really, and he had been on the West Point Board of Visitors and also the Secretary of War in the Franklin Pierce administration. So Davis really had a lot of military credentials that Lincoln lacked. But Lincoln was a careful student of war, and he learned very well. So here we have then the weaker side by every measure, materially, numerically, industrially, you name it, railroad trackage, equipment, manufacturing capability. See, for example, the South had a very significant manufacturing facility in Richmond, Virginia, the Tredegar Iron Works, which primarily had produced rail equipment before the war. Tredegar operated very well during the war, and it produced material of war, but no railroad equipment, which the South very much needed. So there's an example again of this of physical disparity. And R.E. Lee did not emerge very early in the war. Lee did, relatively speaking, poorly early in the war. In West Virginia, his initial combat assignments were not particularly splendid. He was in charge of harbor defense down in South Carolina for a while. He did all right, but nothing to get excited about. He then was brought to Richmond to be what in essence was a chief of staff. Both sides groped toward a modern military staff system during the war. And actually, initially, the South did a better job there too, but as we will see, it's going to botch that badly, and the Union is going to really build a nice embryonic military staff system. And Jones and I have what I regard as one of our more significant articles about that Northern military staff, because historians have tended to underrate it and underplay it, or if not, in fact, overlook it, because in a formal sense it existed for only a relatively short time. But there's such a thing as informal organization. And residually, informally, the Northern military staff continued to function after its official termination. And that's really very significant. You find tremendously superior logistical management and even strategic coordination in the North. Now, what advantages did the South have? Well, of course, first of all, if you're fighting on your own territory, that tends to make you care a bit more, fight perhaps a bit with more enthusiasm or defensiveness. And you enjoy what in military science is called the advantage of interior lines. One of the more spectacular examples of how the South was able to capitalize on interior lines is its internal redeployment after the disasters of Forts Henry and Donaldson, which opened both the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers to the Union advance, to redeploy and concentrate and effectively fight the Battle of Shiloh. Now, Shiloh, in essence, was a tied battle. It's a two-day battle. The South wins pretty spectacularly on the first day, but they lose their commanding general. And the North fights pretty spectacularly on the second day, and they retake all the land that they had lost on the first day. But then the Southern Army gets back into Corinth, Mississippi, where they had based themselves in the first place, and Henry Halleck comes down and takes command of the forces relieving U.S. Grant, and it takes a long time by siege to take Corinth, and then eventually the Confederates under P.G.T. Beauregard are able to withdraw by train to Tupelo, while Halleck thinks that they're being reinforced when in fact they're evacuating. Now, Halleck gets a bad play in too much history. I think it has to do, and of course Brooks is a great specialist and scholar on U.S. Grant. I think many students of U.S. Grant have felt that they need to tear Halleck down to help them build Grant up. Now that's a mistake. You don't need to do that. Grant, of course, was great, but Halleck was great too in his way. He was general-in-chief, but he functioned actually as chief of staff. And especially after Grant emerged in primary command, Halleck and Grant worked well together, very, very well. And Halleck played a tremendously significant role as a go-between between Lincoln and Grant and the other generals. Halleck was a tremendous coordinator between the civilian authority and the military powers. Now, in the 7 Days campaign in the spring of 1862, Joseph E. Johnston was in command of the Confederate force in Virginia, and McClellan had advanced up the peninsula with a very superior northern force and got within sight of the church spires of Richmond, something that no northern military force would be able to do again for about 2 more years. But he stopped. McClellan stopped and did not thrust on into Richmond. And Johnston tried a counteroffensive and scored some points against McClellan's force, although Johnston was wounded. And it turned out to be wounded more badly than had been thought at first. And so after going through 2 or 3 possible choices, Davis gave that Army command to Robert E. Lee, who left Richmond with his staff, and his staff was never replaced. Now that staff made a pretty good command structure for what Lee renamed the Army of Northern Virginia, but it hurt the Confederates tremendously to lose what they had had in Richmond, the beginnings of a general staff. Lee was very aggressive. Lee was willing to take chances. Lee knew that the South was the weaker side, and he believed that the way the South might win the war was to achieve a Saratoga. to achieve a significant killing battle, and preferably on northern soil. So there ensued the so-called 7 Days Campaign. I think I said that earlier, but it wasn't. It was a battle, just a battle. It wasn't the beginning of the 7 Days Campaign, wherein Johnston was wounded. And what's the name of that battle anyway? Fair Oaks or Seven Pines. Fair Oaks or Seven Pines. A lot of the battles have two names, you know, and that's a relatively unusual one, because typically the North names a battle after the nearest stream or body of water, and the South names a battle after the nearest physical feature or town. So here you have Fair Oaks or Seven Pines, but like Manassas Bull Run, well, Manassas is a town in Virginia, whereas Bull Run is a little stream of water that empties into the Potomac River. Or even over in the part of the country that I've been living in for 33 years, Missouri, the Battle of Spring, let's see, it would have been Walnut Hills, or what's the name of this now? You know, the one down in southwest, Wilson's Creek. Wilson's Creek. What's happening here is I'm aging, and there's nothing wrong with the memory bank. The retrieval system is beginning to hang up a little. Yeah, Wilson's Creek. That's a creek, so that's the northern name. Sometimes where you have Bull Run and Manassas, they're very commonly known. Other times the name for that given to the battle by the loser is not well known. But they all tend typically to have two names. So the 7 Days Campaign resulted in Henry Lee and his force being able to push the Army of the Potomac back from the vicinity of Richmond to Harrison's Landing. And Lincoln is momentarily upset with McClellan and raises a new force and gives it to John Pope. And Pope succeeds in getting beaten pretty badly in August of '62 in the Second Battle of Manassas, or Second Bull Run. I guess of all the relieved Army commanders, he fares close to the best. They send him up to Minnesota to fight against the Great Sioux Uprising. So Lee now takes advantage of his very successful victory at Second Manassas and decides to invade the enemy territory. Lee wants to achieve a killing knockout victory, and especially one that's going to bring British and French intervention. And that was a close call. In fact, if we look separately at the issue, when in late '61, the Union had seized a British vessel near the Bahamas, carrying the two Confederate military envoys, one to, is that a Lincoln impersonator there? The two Confederate envoys, James Mason and John Slidell, respectively going to England and France. This comes to be known as the Trent Affair, because it was the HMS Trent, the British vessel that was taken. Now you understand, in terms of international law, a vessel carrying the flag of a nation is regarded as part of that nation. You take that vessel and it's the same thing as you have invaded that nation. So it was very, very serious, and the British were extremely upset, and in fact they sent troops to Canada, which would remain there for the rest of the war. I and one of my graduate students in the first issue of a popular, slick, and pretty good little magazine called American Military History published a piece called "We Shall Cease to Be Friends," which is a quote of Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister. "We shall cease to be friends." And they were very seriously considering thrusting down from Canada to try to take part of the northern United States and add it to British territory. And of course, if the North had found itself fighting a two-front war, it would have had a difficult go of it, for sure, because those British troops were pretty well trained and effective, to be sure. But it didn't come to pass. The troops were there, but they wound up never invading, because the Trent affair was eventually smoothed over with diplomacy. So again, you can say one of the several reasons why the North won was the North had superior diplomacy in the international arena. The North was able, both because of the outcome of certain battles and because of the effectiveness of diplomatic tact, to keep British or French intervention from happening, or Russian intervention. Or the Pope, for example, sent Jefferson Davis a letter, and it is sometimes said that it was the Vatican that was the only European power to recognize the existence of the Confederacy. How many divisions does the Pope have? After Jefferson Davis was imprisoned, the Pope sent Jefferson Davis a crown of thorns, which is on display at one of the museums of the Confederacy in New Orleans, Louisiana. Very interesting thing to see. So now the South then is going to lose in part because it can't get any foreign aid. Now, following up on the victory at Second Manassas, R.E. Lee decides to thrust into Maryland. Now, he's not just planning on taking Maryland, although that is one of the objectives. He has high hopes that he'll be able to recruit a lot of Maryland troops. After all, Maryland was part of the South. Maryland was a slave state. There's an interesting little book that I just finished reading a couple of days ago by James McPherson, whole little book-length study of Antietam. And I hadn't really actually known this before, but one of the things that he points out is that that portion of Maryland that Lee thrust into, i.e. the western portion, was the more pro-northern and less fanatically pro-southern portion. So if they had thrust into the eastern portion, they might have fared better, but that's not what they did. And as things unfold, McClellan has the tremendous good luck of one of his people discovering a copy of Lee's plans for the next few days. And he says, here is a document with which if I cannot beat Bobby Lee, I'll be willing to go home. But McClellan doesn't do very well. He doesn't move rapidly as he should have, and he doesn't plan, and he doesn't see to it that his plan that he does make is adequately executed. McClellan planned a good battle for what turned out to be the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg. Antietam is a creek that empties into the Potomac. Sharpsburg is a town in Maryland. The Confederates are going to fight on the defensive. Now, this is an interesting thing which has relatively little to do with answering the question how the North won, but has a lot to do with explaining the Civil War. They didn't appreciate the value of cover and concealment. Now, cover is actual physical protection from incoming enemy fire. Concealment is being hidden from enemy view. You'd like to have both. If you can only have one, you'd prefer cover. But you certainly want one or the other. And they didn't appreciate that. They just didn't know. And why? Well, because the old way of making war was to exchange a few volleys and then close physically into close proximity and to fight it out hand to hand. But that's not going to happen in the Civil War because firepower has increased better, and the defense is sufficient now that there's going to be very, very little closing and fighting hand to hand. and bayonet fighting. Very, very, very little bayonet fighting in the Civil War. There will be some. Brooks and I were looking at some thing, I think maybe in that tabloid about the Civil War news, wherein they're returning a Confederate flag that had been captured at Fredericksburg. And Brooks and I, were there any Confederate flags captured at Fredericksburg? And I said, well, you know, over there on the extreme right, there was a momentary closure of the troops, and it was a little hand-to-hand fighting, and that's probably where that flag was captured, where the day was saved by the boy artillerist. What's his name, Porter? Pelham, John Pelham, yes, the gallant Pelham. The day is saved by the gallant Pelham over there on the extreme right. That's at Fredericksburg, but we're talking about Antietam now. So McClellan has this plan which, in a sense, at the least in a sense, is what we call a double envelopment. He's going to make a thrust against the center, and he's going to close in and try to engulf both flanks. But it's going to unfold serially instead of coordinatedly like it was supposed to. It starts in the north, it comes back to the center, and it ends in the south. And it takes almost all day. And Lee is not entrenched. Just as at Shiloh, nobody had been entrenched. But what happens? At Shiloh, the retreating Federals managed to get into a thicket, which is going to be called the Hornet's Nest. They've got some concealment. And I think there's a road there too. Roads tend to sink down unless they're well-maintained and macadamized, which is a French process where they put gravel on them, or even whatever they call it, they put logs on. Yeah, that pillaring. If they haven't had that done to them, they sink over time. So you got a trench, a natural-made trench. Well, so the Hornet's Nest is able to buy some valuable time for the Federals on the first day at Shiloh, and the so-called Sunken Road or Bloody Lane is going to buy a lot of time and actually produce a lot of battle deaths for the Northern troops at Antietam. In fact, but for two things, there was a little dead space beyond the Bloody Lane. Now, dead space is area out to the rear of an assaulting force where they're sufficiently low that the incoming fire is, relatively speaking, not going to reach them. Dead space. In more modern times, well, they had them then too, but they didn't have them right then there. You overcome the problem of dead space with mortar fire, high-angle artillery fire, lobbing it into the dead space. So a little bit of dead space, and then a slight misunderstanding by some of the Confederate officers, wherein they move back a little bit, and then there's a little bit of enfilade fire produced. Now, this is a complicated thing that can be easily simplified. On the one hand, somebody dies in battle because somebody else aimed a shot at them accurately and pulled the trigger, and the bullet hit them, and they died. But on the other hand, if you got a mass of troops here and another mass of opposing troops there, and they're firing in to each other's position, what you have is what's called a beaten zone, where the bullets land. Because if the bullet comes down and hits you, you're just as dead as if somebody had aimed it right at you and managed to kill you on purpose. So there's this volume of incoming fire. Now, it so happens that more bullets will fall long and short than they will left and right. So the beaten zone is going to be elliptical. And you have what is called enfilade fire when the long axis of the beaten zone coincides with the long axis of the emplaced troops. In other words, if you're trying to hold a line and there's somebody out there in front of you, you're not taking on enfilade fire. But if they come at you from the side, either side, you take it on enfilade fire. And you're going to take on more casualties. And that's what happened to end the Confederate defense of Bloody Lane. So they pulled back. But because this battle is unfolding so cantankerously, McClellan is doing such a bad job of managing, and I guess the coup de grace is Burnside, Ambrose E. Burnside, who is leading the assault on the Federal left, the Confederate right. And they have this creek, see, Antietam Creek, that the Confederates are behind. Now, it's fordable in several places, and in fact, a few of Burnside's people do get across by wading. But for the most part, they ignore the possibility of fording, and they want to take that bridge, which is officially called the Rohrbach Bridge, but later will be renamed the Burnside Bridge. And they take 2-3 hours trying to take it. They finally do take it, of course, but that's valuable time lost, giving the Confederates the possibility of redeployment. Well, the long and the short of it is, September 17, 1862 is going to turn out to have been the bloodiest single day in all of American military history. If you count the Southerners as Americans, more Americans get killed and wounded on that day than any other. It had looked like 11-11-01 was going to surpass it, 9-11-01, whatever it is, 9-11-01. So much so that that Stanchak, the editor of Civil War Times Illustrated, wrote an editorial admitting that, well, 9/11/01 has surpassed Antietam as the bloodiest single day. But it turned out that the casualties were grossly overestimated, and there weren't nearly as many people in those Twin Towers, and a lot more people managed to get out than they initially feared, that it didn't surpass Antietam, which still remains to this day the bloodiest single day in American military history. And a major turning point in the war, because R.E. Lee has failed to achieve his Saratoga. Now, what ensues? The war goes much more badly for the Confederacy in the Western Theater. In fact, it's a fact that the Federals win the war in the Western Theater. Chickasaw Bayou notwithstanding, where my man S.D. Lee manages just north of Vicksburg to defeat a force thrust down from Memphis by William Tecumseh Sherman. That's in December and early January 62-63. But the rest of 63 is going to unfold pretty badly for the Confederates in the Western Theater. They're going to lose Vicksburg, another major turning point in the war, because that was Vicksburg and Port Hudson were giving the Confederates a segment of the Mississippi River that they could control and easily cross. And no longer is there a segment, and so there was no longer any point in holding a single place, i.e. Port Hudson, so it surrendered shortly after Vicksburg fell too. In fact, if you study carefully, I think you will find that the Vicksburg campaign is the most brilliant one of the war fought by U.S. Grant. The Vicksburg campaign is the most brilliant campaign of the war as fought by U.S. Grant. Now, how could things have turned out differently? Well, not too long after that, Grant took a really nasty fall from his horse, and he was laid up for 6 weeks. Now, instead of 6 weeks, let's postulate quadriplegic. That's not impossible. It could have been that way. In fact, we can also say that Abraham Lincoln went out to see some enemy fire at Fort Stevens, one of the so-called fortifications that surrounded Washington, D.C., when Jubal Early was making a raid to try to get into Washington, D.C. In fact, when things looked the worst, and I'm skipping Gettysburg here, but I'll come back and touch on Gettysburg a little. When things looked the worst was the summer of '64, because war weariness was beginning to weigh in badly. And Atlanta was tenaciously holding on against an onslaught. Jubal early, got within 5 miles of Washington, D.C. That's when things looked the worst for the North. But what happened? Atlanta fell. Jubal Early did not get into Washington, D.C. Phil Sheridan scored a notable victory in the Shenandoah Valley. That was a major turning point in the war. The late summer and very early fall of '64. But let's go back to Gettysburg and at least give it some due. Lee had invaded the North again, or he had hoped he'd invaded it. Actually, all he wound up doing was raiding. You know, the difference between raid and invasion, if you invade, you take some territory and hold it. If you raid, you just move through some territory. You might do some damage, and they did do a lot of damage, actually. They took Harper's Ferry, got a lot of supplies, and took a lot of contraband. That's what they called, the North started calling them that. The blacks who were freed from slavery, the North called them contraband. The North justified keeping them and not returning them to slavery by virtue of them being contraband of war. But the South called them contraband too, but the difference was if the South captured them, they were going to send them back into slavery, and they did during the Gettysburg campaign. Captured a lot of those people and sent them back into slavery. So they got a lot of supplies, and they got some contraband, but they're going to meet a tremendous stultifying defeat. We were talking about this in the car yesterday. Here's a 3-day battle that Lee manages the poorest showing of his life. And that's an amazing contrast from just a couple of 3 months before at the Battle of Chancellorsville, where Lee looked his best. And, you know, two things. How the North won is and has been on the recommended reading list for career American military people ever since it came out, and it still is, and I'm very proud of that. But the study of Lee's strategic conduct of the Chancellorsville campaign not only is something that American military people study, but around the world they study, because that was a brilliant campaign. But it cost the South the life of Stonewall Jackson. And so it is often said, what if Jackson had not been killed, and what if he was with the Confederates as they thrust toward Gettysburg in search of shoes? My God, Jackson would have taken Culp's Hill on the first day, and that battle would have unfolded differently. I tend to believe that, but I cannot know. You cannot know what might have happened. You can speculate. I have my late-in-career vanity piece coming out in December. Now, if you don't know what that is, that's a book-length compendium of articles and speeches, most of which, but not all, have been previously published. And I noticed, I didn't even remember, but I noticed in reading it again, making the index, I actually have this in one of my pieces. If you want to sit around and play the what-if game, which a lot of people do like to do, although professional historians are all much enjoying not to play that game, what if the South had won the Civil War? I mean, McKinley Cantor wrote a delightful book about that. It takes 3 hours to read. I recommend it highly. I've read it several times. I love it. In McKinley Cantor's book, it's the sinking of the CSS Mississippi in Havana Harbor that brings about the Confederate Spanish-American War, which is won by the Confederacy. And the great hero of that war is Rel Stewart, R-E-L Stewart, Robert E. Lee Stewart, the son of Jeb Stewart, born right after the war. And Rel likes to talk about how often his father had spoken about how he might have been killed in the Civil War, and Rel never would have been born, which is exactly the way it was, in truth, you see. Stewart was killed in the war, and Rel never was born. So we're looking at fiction here. But now let's go on with my speculation. If the South had won the Civil War, Germany would have won World War II. Germany would have won World War I. There would not have been a World War II. And the great powers of the 20th century would have been Germany and Japan, and not Russia and the U.S. That's my speculation, anyway, if you like to play that game. Well, Lee had given orders, if practicable, to seize the heights below the town. Well, the commander on the spot wasn't Andrew Jackson, and if practicable didn't seem to be practicable to him, so he stopped. So that gave initially the Federals an advantage of higher ground. And they weren't concentrated there at first. Maybe if somehow the Confederates had been able to move more rapidly and to fight more viciously on the first day, they might have made the Battle of Gettysburg turn out differently, but they didn't. And on the second day, they tried striking the Union left, having tried to strike the right the first day, and they get stymied. They can't do it. It looks pretty good for a while, but they can't do it. So here's the third day. Lee says, well, I hit them on the left. I hit them on my left, their right, and I hit them on my right, their left, and I couldn't do it. So let's just try the center. They must be weakest in the center. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, the firepower of the defense is what's wrong with that, but it had only been a relatively few years before Napoleon III at the Battle of Solferino had achieved exactly what Lee was trying to achieve on the third day at Gettysburg. He burst through the center and then began rolling up the enemy. See, you bust through the center, then you got them divided, you can roll up the flanks, you can put enfilade fire out there, man, you can score a spectacular victory. And then what? Well, by God, then you go take Harrisburg, PA, Philadelphia, PA, Washington, D.C. The Union has to move its capital to Columbus, Ohio, and you win the war. But it didn't happen that way. So they tried militarily, and they did pretty well. But they're not going to win the war militarily. Of course, Gettysburg and Vicksburg in early July '63 aren't the end of the war. It's about the halfway point. And what happened? What happens after Gettysburg and Vicksburg? There are draft riots in New York City and other cities as well, but most seriously in New York City. John Hunt Morgan thrusts into Indiana and subsequently Ohio, bringing the hard hand of war to another portion of the northern populace. And most notably, the Battle of Chickamauga, a tremendous successful battle for the Confederates in Tennessee in the latter part of '63. But what happens after that? Well, the Confederates failed to retake and hold Chattanooga. They lose the Battle of Chattanooga, the so-called Battle Above the Clouds, and worst of all, they lose the Battle of Missionary Ridge. And they have to move completely away from that vicinity of territory. The North gets Chattanooga as a base of operations, which William Tecumseh Sherman will use in his subsequent Atlanta campaign. And Braxton Bragg is finally, after much too long a time, relieved from command by Jefferson Davis, although then Davis brings him to Richmond, Virginia to make him a principal advisor to the president, which is very unpopular. Although Braxton Bragg is actually pretty intelligent, but he's very unpopular. So here we have then the Confederates not winning the war militarily and not winning the war diplomatically and with respect to foreign intervention. What's the last chance? War weariness. And what would have been the great scale tipper? Either the failure of Abraham Lincoln to win re-election in November of '64, or his assassination 6 months previous to the time that he was assassinated. Either one of those could have tipped the scale. But as we've already said, and I'm getting close to my closing moment, Atlanta, after a long period of time successfully defended by the Confederates, was taken by Sherman. It was a close call, and Abraham Lincoln is shouted at by Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, "Get down, you damn fool, you're going to get shot." Well, now suppose Lincoln had took one between the eyes. That wouldn't have been impossible. That wouldn't have been impossible. That might have made the war turn out differently, but that didn't happen. Lincoln did get down and didn't get shot. And Early didn't get into Washington, D.C. and Sheridan scored a big victory, and then Lincoln won re-election. Now you can say it's inevitable after that, unless something spectacular happens, unless Grant is again thrown from a horse, and this time really is paralyzed, or unless Lincoln is assassinated, which doesn't happen. It's inevitable. It's inevitable after the election of 1864, unless something big enough happens, which doesn't. And so Sherman thrusts from Atlanta to Savannah, takes Savannah in time to present it to Lincoln as a Christmas present in '64. Hood, meanwhile, disengages and thrusts up into Tennessee and fights the disastrous battles of Franklin and Nashville, in which a huge portion of that army is destroyed. In fact, in essence, that army is incapable of functioning as an army anymore, although remnants of it were reorganized and sent into North Carolina to fight the last campaign near Bentonville. And Lee finally is forced to surrender because his lines have been stretched so thin he can hold Richmond no longer. He's going to try to withdraw in time to get around the Federal Army and get back into North Carolina and you unite with the forces that are now under Joseph E. Johnston. And maybe, and here with this we'll end, it's a logistical screw-up. Lee had been fighting extensively. He needed food. The supply people thought he probably most needed ammunition. He gets to the railhead at Amelia Courthouse, there's a load of ammunition there, but no food. They're hungry, they're tired, they're demoralized, they're gradually being killed off, bang, bang, bang. And incidentally, again, with our clothes, there are enough examples of these happy accidents, like the Hornet's Nest at Shiloh, the Bloody Lane at Antietam, the Stone Wall at Fredericksburg. There are enough happy accidents like that. By '64, by God, they know that they need to entrench. Every day when they stop, they've got to entrench. And that's what makes the fighting in '64 so bitter and drawn out and indecisive, because they do entrench and they can fend off even superior forces that attack the defenders. Well, thank you very much. And let's have a little discussion, if anybody would like to discuss anything.
I'm curious, what is the connection to a Southern victory in the Civil War and Germany winning the war in World War I?
Oh, well, if the South had won the Civil War, the United States would have been a lot weaker. And the United States is the scale tipper in World War I. That's the connection.
I always like to point out to people, when you brought up the what if, I'm not a big fan of the what ifs of the world, because what ifs never happen.
We're not supposed to be, but I can't resist it.
And I'm very, very glad of that. I know when I hear, I'm the vice president of a Civil War roundtable, so when I hear that if Stonewall Jackson was alive, he would have taken the higher ground, I always like to remind people that the King of Siam sent a letter to Abraham Lincoln and offered him a herd of elephants that he could have used at Gettysburg. So I always remind Southern sympathizers that while there could have been a herd of elephants in the middle of the hill too.
That might have made a good difference.
Right. Or Segway scooters if property leaked.
Well, and think about this. The U.S. Army had a lot of camels in the years before the Civil War. I mean, if they still had camels, the war would have unfolded differently.
The additional comment that I'd like to make and have you respond is I think that the reason, and you alluded to it, that the South won the war was they had one, I mean the South lost the war. They had one chance to win, and that was that Abraham Lincoln was willing to lose.
Well, in a way he was. At the outset, he was willing to negotiate. He wanted to negotiate a restored union. He said, if you guys will will come back, if you'll sit down at the table and talk and come back, I'll let you keep slavery.
But that's a what if, and that never happened.
That's right.
And again, I don't like to do the what if. So, what I'm saying is I think the difference between Davis and Lincoln is that Lincoln was willing to admit I was wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And-
Oh, you're right about that. And Davis was not willing to admit I was
He
wrong.
explained to the Northern Society that although we are not perfect, we're not going to let Jeff Davis's perfect society spread to the territories.
Yeah.
I'd like you to comment on that.
Oh, that's another thing, which I didn't touch on at all, but does count. See, Jefferson Davis is famous for having said early in the war, all we want is to be left alone. That was never true. All we wanted was all the slave states, that would be Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and we also wanted Arizona and New Mexico, which is our fair share of the Southern contribution to the Mexican War. That's what all we wanted, and we tried to get it. Did our damnedest to get it. Yeah.
I think the single most powerful word you used was inevitable towards the end of your speech. And I know when I go out and talk to the war about people not familiar, we try to explain to them that it wasn't inevitable, like you said, until the political victory.
Nothing's really inevitable until it finally happens, but it gets to where it is inevitable unless something spectacular occurs to change that eventuality.
To explain to people nowadays.
If Lincoln had had a heart attack, he don't have to be shot, he could just have a heart attack.
Poor health.
Could have happened. He was in poor health. He was in poor health. There's a lot of speculation that if he had not been assassinated, he'd have died shortly afterwards anyway, because he had Marfan syndrome.
What I find useful to explain to people is that they had a series, month after month, of 9/11s happen where people didn't know what was going on and thought that they could lose the war.
Yeah.
And people nowadays, they read the history books, and of course, we, the ones who won, wrote them. They just look and say we had more guns, more men, more everything, so it was never we would win. And you explain
Yeah, that's interesting that you say we, the ones that won, are writing the books. Thomas L. Conley Jr., who died about 12 years ago, and about whom I and one of my doctoral offspring are putting together a compendium book of tribute essays we hope to have on the next fall list, especially in his books about the postbellum South. Will Campbell and the Soul of the South, and whatever the one he did with his wife, I forget the name of it, but anyway, his then wife. I lost track of how many he had, because he was living with people that he wasn't married to, and I wasn't sure. But anyway, people like Tom Conley and like me think of ourselves as Southerners. Our people lost the war. Yeah.
Like my friend Bob likes to say, even in Southern defeat, the South won because the North won.
in that sense,
The
yeah.
Southern historians are doing an awesome job of telling the truth. Shelby Foote, William Davis, William Howell, they're awesome.
Oh, yeah. Now Conley, on the other hand, you see, did see, I see he's dead for a dozen years, the great paradox of it all. On the one hand, we are patriotic. Hell, I'm a veteran, and I'm damn proud of it. I wanted to serve in the United States Army. It was very important to me. I grew up knowing that I would someday serve in the United States Army. I'm lucky enough not to have a hat like that. I'm what's called a tweener. I was too young to have to go to fight in Korea, and already a veteran when Vietnam came along. But I've got the state of Kansas in which I reside has license plates for your car, veteran, and I'm really proud to have that. I love it. I love being a veteran.
And I'm sure, Lincoln became president last week. And you mentioned in 1864 the war was not going well. It was perceived
That's right.
as a quagmire.
That's
The
right.
Democrats run a general as their candidate.
With a peace plank in their platform.
And if it sounds all very familiar somehow.
Doesn't it? Doesn't it?
In November of 1864, it had been perceived as being a quagmire. Atlanta had not fallen, and McClellan had won, not to venture too far. How much of a chance did McClellan have of winning if the war had not gone so well, close enough to play?
I think he had a very big chance of winning if the war had not gone very well.
What would have happened?
Well, I don't know. McClellan claimed that he would have repudiated the peace plank, but I don't know that he could have done that if the Democrats had in fact won control of the government in '64.
In emancipation, he would have rescinded.
I dare say so.
The Republican platform, the fifth resolve on that platform was the 13th Amendment.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. That is true.
Everybody knew it.
Let me tell you, first of all, a little true fact about me. It may make some of you not like me as well, I'm afraid. The last Democrat I voted for was Jimmy Davis for the governor of Louisiana in 1960. Now, that said, the only other father and son team of presidents were John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and they were the only two presidents in the first 50 years in the history of the Republic to each only have one term. It sure looks to me like the president incumbent is setting himself up for a repeat of the John Adams, John Quincy Adams phenomenon.
Sir, your comment about if Lincoln had died of a heart attack or a bullet, whatever, and that might have caused the North to not win the war. Talk a little bit about Roosevelt's death. What about the vice president? Why is it necessarily a given that the North would have lost its...
Well, that's a good point. That's a good point, because Harry Truman proved to be a very effective in-game president. Now, could Andrew Johnson have done that? I don't know. I just really don't know.
Seward might have stepped in and helped.
Seward would have helped, of course. He was Secretary of State.
Chase,
The cabinet was
I think his cabinet was strong enough.
The cabinet was strong and able, and might well have been able to effectively aid Johnson in the end game. That's definitely true. Again, that's some more of that what if, but it's certainly true.
This is a question about the changing sentiments of the South as you've experienced it in the last 30 years. I've been reading articles saying that during that time, much more people are come to identify themselves as Southerners. And plus, I'm hearing much more arguments about the Civil War really being about states' rights, not about slavery.
Yeah.
And a lot of more pro-Confederacy kind of stances. Have you felt, what have you felt the attitude shift been in the general Southern culture towards the war?
Oh, I don't think I've sensed much change. It's all paradoxical and tragic. On the one hand, we wish we didn't have that. See, Southerners have something in their historical heritage that non-Southerners do not have, and that is our people lost a big war. Americans don't know what it means to lose a big war because Vietnam wasn't big enough. We lost it all right, but it wasn't big enough. It does something to the psyche. Connolly thinks it affects Southern music, country music. That the Southern persona is, on the one hand, we love America, but on the other hand, by God, we love the South, and we wish somehow we didn't have this. And William Faulkner, An Intruder in the Dust. It is all for every Southern boy still early in the afternoon on July the 3rd, 1863, and the charge has not yet happened, but this time when it does, the outcome's going to be different.
That's a good one.